6, going dark.
Over 1 year ago, I published a series called Growing Up with Gaming that analyzed the toxicity found in gaming culture, the presentation of video games in the media, and how violent content influences both of those concepts. And while there have been some huge, relevant conversations made in the 12 months since those videos were published, I'm not here to make a follow-up. Instead, this video was brought on by recent discussions about a specific piece of content in one of the biggest releases of the year. I'm talking about the white phosphorus controversy in Call of Duty Modern Warfare. That whole situation made me think a little deeper about violence in video games and our reactions to gaming critique. This isn't a debate over whether the inclusion of violence is wrong or right. It's about tonal consistency, about tastefulness, about presentation, and it's about how that influences our perception of other aspects of gaming culture. I'm going to look at this through an artistic lens as both a fan and as a critic, so I might say some things you won't like. This isn't a staunch defense of gaming. This is a critical, artistic analysis that assumes this is a medium on par with film and music, something that's worthy of critique. I hope at no point you hear something I say and think that I hate video games, because we'll actually talk about that later. But for now, Call of Duty. Let's break open that can of worms. Recently, controversy arose from the inclusion of white phosphorus as a kill streak in the latest Call of Duty. White phosphorus, if you're unaware, is an incendiary compound that's been used in incendiary weapons since World War I. It causes intense burns and other side effects that result from chemical exposure, like organ damage and bone disease. Banned from use on civilians in the 80s and still used on a case-by-case basis in armed conflicts to this day, white phosphorus is a very legally obscure weapon shrouded in controversy. White phosphorus is also a chemical used in smoke rounds, but the weapon in question is specifically the incendiary kind. In a gaming context, anyone who's played Spec Ops: The Line knows the devastating effects of white phosphorus strikes. I hope that understanding white phosphorus and its real-world implications can at least help make you understand why some may find some issues with it being represented in a video game, specifically in a multiplayer context. I'm a huge fan of Call of Duty, and I have been for over a decade at this point. I've played every single game in the franchise, even Finest Hour and Big Red One, and I'm extremely excited for Modern Warfare. I've got a digital pre-order and everything. I want to make it clear, I am a Call of Duty fan, and I know what I'm talking about when it comes to Call of Duty. If someone hears what I'm about to say and then says I'm not a fan, that person would be objectively incorrect. I take issue with the game's inclusion of white phosphorus. Modern Warfare is being marketed as a morally ambiguous, gray area kind of game, and I get that, but that's the campaign. Despite being one part of the same package, Call of Duty's campaigns are, more often than not, tonally inconsistent with the multiplayer component, and that's not exactly a fresh take. The rock music that plays when leveling up, the points from each kill, that's not in the campaign. See, I'm not against the portrayal of white phosphorus in the game's campaign. It's obviously trying to tell a relevant, kind of edgy story about the gray area that exists between good and bad. My issue lies in its portrayal in multiplayer. It's nearly impossible to create any sense of moral ambiguity in a PvP multiplayer setting. The Last of Us is the only game that I've played that even comes close, but even then, it's fun. And perhaps that's more of a statement about us as people than it is the game, but I'll get to that in a bit. The point is that multiplayer modes are inherently meant to be high on fun, low on moral challenge. That might be a real human being on the end of your gun, but you're not actually doing any harm to them, aside from the occasional broken controller. The rock music, the points, the leveling up, it's inherently meant to make the player feel like they're having fun, not embarking on a morally ambiguous and harrowing PvP experience designed to criticize the fallacy of war. The rules that apply to the campaign's tone do not apply to the multiplayers. Therein lies the hypocrisy of trying to present a morally ambiguous multiplayer experience consistent with what they're trying to do with the campaign. You can't. At least not in Call of Duty. The presence of white phosphorus in multiplayer isn't meant to raise questions about the morality of using weapons banned by international law. It's a reward for shooting enough people without dying. Spec Ops' portrayal of white phosphorus wasn't in any kind of glorifying context. It knew damn well the implications white phosphorus has. They're not comparable. And you could argue, well, what about nukes? Those are way worse and those are kill streaks. What about napalm, mustard gas? What about this? What about that? And to that I say, exactly. Anyone who says that is so close to seeing the conversation being made, it's actually frustrating. And to address that what about historical weapons argument more directly, I do think there's something worth looking into there. Perhaps something I'll go into on another video. But for now, I think stuff like mustard gas or napalm are different from white phosphorus because they're being presented in a historical context, whereas white phosphorus is still being used to terrible effect. When a weapon like mustard gas is presented, it's done so retrospectively. The age of worrying about thermonuclear warfare is essentially over too. The tactical nuke is basically science fiction at this point. White phosphorus airstrikes are still very much a terrifying reality. The utter audacity to have any sort of issue with portraying such a morally heavy weapon like white phosphorus as a reward, sarcasm by the way, was not unnoted by the typical reactionary crowd on Twitter and YouTube. The narrative quickly became, people who don't play Call of Duty are upset about a game they don't play, and are upset because it has a bad weapon in it. These people are soft, they don't actually like games, they're just trying to censor a game that's trying to be fun. This is exactly why I wanted to preface this part of the video by saying that I love Call of Duty. I didn't platinum Modern Warfare 2 only to end up being told that my opinion about this franchise doesn't matter. The criticisms I've seen of the white phosphorus situation have been a lot like the one I just made. It's distasteful to use it as a reward, it feels a bit out of place in comparison to the campaign, and maybe its place should be reconsidered. In my view, the journalists or other personalities weren't calling for outright censorship or a ban or anything of the sort. They just seemed disappointed, really. They're not saying don't have white phosphorus under any circumstance or context. They're saying if you're gonna do it, make sure you do it respectfully and for the right reasons. It reminds me of the Doom Eternal non-controversy, if you will, that surrounded people allegedly being absolutely outraged over a joke made in the QuakeCon 2018 demo, when in reality it was more of a mild disappointment. But to the reactionary crowd I mentioned before, it was a cataclysmic event that required dozens of videos and hours of analysis. I highly recommend you check out Sean's video about the subject, which I'll link to in the description. But you can see the parallel here. And here's the kicker in all this, and I want you to listen carefully because this is important. This is the one thing I'd want you to take from this video. I think the reason people get upset about games journalists or whoever criticizing certain violent elements in video games is because violence is so interlinked and inherent to the enjoyment of video games. Many gamers perceive a criticism of violence in gaming as a criticism of gaming itself. Which leads me to the next part of this video. Think about the games that have lined the history of this industry in the past 40 years. Final Fantasy, Contra, Street Fighter 2, even Super Mario Bros. The only way you progress is by cutting, shooting, punching, or stomping on anything that gets in your way. Even in the most cartoonish sense, video games have been laced with violence almost since day one. It's what we know. It's the language we speak as video game enthusiasts. You have a problem, you fight your way through it. You punch, you kick, you shoot, you stab, you throw a fireball, you kill, or otherwise dispatch the problem. And yeah, I know there are games like Deus Ex, Metal Gear Solid, and Dishonored that let you play non-lethally, but you still use violent means to achieve your goals. You're still choking, tranquilizing, shocking, you get the deal. You're not killing, but you're still partaking in violent acts. And if you think that video games started off non-violent and became so over time, one of the first video games ever created is Space War. It's in the DNA of the industry. And now that creators have started making some alternatives to the traditional formula, what do? It's a walking simulator. It's boring. It's pretentious. What do? All you do is walk? Where's the fun in that? It's the same way in film. The biggest movies of the year are the giant budget comic book adaptations or action blockbusters, while the films that win Oscars, the big Oscars that is, are usually relatively smaller budget dramas free of killing or shootouts or caped heroes. The highest intensity reached might be a heated argument or a physical altercation. There is an obvious disparity between what is popular and what is considered good, regardless of the entertainment medium. It's always interesting to see someone really attuned to current pop culture trends and the biggest releases trying even the most surface level of art films like Drive or Birdman. What might be painfully slow or void of any interesting action to one person can be absolutely riveting to another. I think film has always had alternatives to violent features, so that's why there's always been such an established audience for those kinds of films. Just comparing the Best Picture nominations from last year to last year's Game of the Year nominations, only one game doesn't involve killing or hurting anything, compared to the 7 out of 8 films nominated for Best Picture that didn't rely on the protagonist being a super cool badass. Video games just haven't had a lot of those alternatives until relatively recently with the indie boom in games like Gone Home and The Walking Dead. And The Walking Dead has violence, I know, but this is where I come all the way back to the Call of Duty White Phosphorus debate. It's about tone, it's about consistency and presentation. Does the violence the game portrays fit with the message? Does it fit with the tone? Those are questions that are essential to the critique of gaming content, and it's why you see articles about stuff like the White Phosphorus stuff in Call of Duty. Is it tastefully represented? Is it consistent with the overarching tone of the game? If we don't ask these questions about art, there's no incentive to improve or change. If we don't demand deeper thinking in our art, there won't be any desire to make any of them worth thinking about in a deeper context. Perhaps I'm overthinking this. Perhaps it's not worth thinking about at all. Maybe I'm just seeking a world where the best is also the most successful, regardless of genre. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's an entire universe of possibilities beyond violence, and instead of mocking or disregarding those alternatives, we should at the very least say, that might not be for me, but at least it's for somebody. Maybe the analog I should be making here isn't to film, but to anime. Anime is often seen as this giant, self-contained genre of animation and styling, but once you dive deeper beyond the heavy hitters and famous shonen franchises, you realize that it's a world filled with a variety of genres and specific tastes that rivals any medium. You might start off by saying, I like anime, but once you broaden your horizons and watch enough, you realize that, oh, I'm open to all anime, but I prefer mecha anime, or isekai, or seinen, or the supremely underrated josei genre. A lot of gamers feel like they need to try everything, or they'll miss out on a key conversation, or that they'll be seen as lesser gamers. And to that, I say this: some things just aren't for you, and that's okay. I don't like most isekai shows, but that doesn't mean I don't like anime. I don't like MOBAs or beat-em-ups, and that definitely doesn't mean I don't like video games. You're never going to play everything, and it would be unhealthy to try. You have to come to accept that some things just weren't made with you in mind, and that's fine. Think about a game's target audience. Are you it? Is a game like Inside really trying to grab someone who's not interested in side-scrolling, narrative-focused platformers? If you don't like third-person adventure games, why bother giving them your attention in the form of negative comments and replies? And to get a little spicy, you could apply that same logic to game critique. If you don't like it when people treat games like a respected art medium, just don't consider gaming to be an art medium and ignore the criticism, no matter how level-headed or reasonable it might sound. It's not for you, so why care? Why get upset? Well, that went somewhere, didn't it? From White Phosphorus maybe shouldn't be treated as a reward, to violence is in gaming's DNA, to hey, tastes exist. But we're not done yet, folks. I still have one last thing to say. It's a more direct criticism of specific titles rather than the industry as a whole. It's about video games that criticize violence in other video games. Game developers aren't unaware of the normality of violence in gaming mechanics. In the past decade or so, there's been a movement toward adding alternatives to going in guns blazing in situations. Even famously violent franchises like Wolfenstein added some light stealth mechanics, and we saw a resurgence in Deus Ex style game design and quote-unquote pacifist options in Dishonored and Deus Ex Human Revolution. Games like Deus Ex and Dishonored basically present the player with a simple choice: to kill or not to kill. Going lethal is more often than not the easier option of the two. It's way faster, can have way more range, more ammo, more weapon variety, there's no threat of the enemy waking up later, no dealing with inconsistent sightlines. All in all, it's considerably more convenient than the stealth or non-lethal option. With non-lethal, you might be stuck with a more limited amount of weapons, close range options, less ammo, more complex or confusing abilities. You need better observation skills to notice openings in the level design and to deal with enemy sightlines, and the patience to wait for certain opportunities. I think most people would agree that playing a ghost run of Metal Gear Solid 4 is objectively more difficult than playing a non-stealth focused lethal run of the same game. Staying on Metal Gear Solid 4, there's an element to that game that I think could serve as a great critique of violence in the future, and is a solid alternative to what's presented even in modern video games. I'm honestly surprised it hasn't been considered a bit more deeply. I'm talking about the psych gauge. The psych gauge is a way of monitoring Snake's stress in Metal Gear Solid 4. If you're constantly wrapped up in firefights, stress will increase and the psych gauge will deplete. The less psych you have, the slower your health regeneration will be, making it harder to sustain extended gunfights. That in and of itself is a great way to incentivize players to avoid lethal violence in the first place. But another thing it does that I love is what happens when you reach 100% stress. If you kill enough people within a specific span of time, you'll hear a quote from Metal Gear Solid. It's actually the Twin Snakes redub, and then Snake will vomit.
You enjoy the killing.
It's a real gameplay ramification that interrupts gameplay and makes the player feel uncomfortable. It's a smart idea, but talking directly to the player to make them think about why and how they play games is a bit par for the course for Hideo Kojima.
You enjoy all the killing.
On a similar note, shaming a player for using lethal force when there's no logical reason not to is essentially the same as shaming a player for playing on an easier difficulty, but without actually making a statement on why that player resorted to violence in the first place. In a game that tries to make a statement about violence, it should either be a deliberate course of action decided on by the player or the only option available to them. A deliberate course of action so it can make a statement about how you, the player, chose to kill when you didn't have to, and the only option so developers can cultivate an entire experience centered around taking advantage of that. And no game takes advantage of killing being the only option better than Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops: The Line takes advantage of any and all of the player's expectations for what a war game or even a third-person shooter should be. The only thing you do is shoot, 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 and kill, kill, kill. What you shoot and how you kill changes from time to time, but it plays like standard shooter fare, and that's the point. It points a finger at the player and says, you didn't even think twice about any of that, did you? Constantly justified in your belief as a seasoned video game player and by the reinforcement from the protagonist, you have some morally challenging and questionable moments from time to time, but the faith that what you're doing is right is never fully shaken until the rug is completely pulled out from under you. It starts off as one thing, but becomes another. It's actually a bit relevant to this video now that I think about it. That's what it means to cultivate an experience centered around taking advantage of the game's one and only form of progression: shooting people. It's a genius critique of violence in our medium. Metal Gear Solid, the first one, also had a similar execution of its critique, though its critique casts a bit of a wider net than Spec Ops: The Line's. Spec Ops is directly critiquing military shooters, whereas Metal Gear Solid was more general. This was the 90s, so military shooters weren't really the most common or most popular releases yet. As such, Metal Gear Solid points its finger at what I spent the beginning of part 2 talking about: how violence is pretty much the only way forward in most video games. Hideo Kojima saw how quick players were to accept that violence was the natural order of video games. So when Liquid has his monologue at the end and criticizes Snake for his actions, he's not actually talking to Snake, he's talking to you, the person responsible for his actions. Of course, it's a bit hypocritical since there weren't exactly any other options, but it's more of a criticism of the player's acceptance of violence than it is the industry's. The modern method of criticizing or punishing violence and violent players is a lot more subtle, and it's something that couldn't be done without modern technology. Audio design, facial capture, animation, world design, these are all essential to make the player feel at one in the world they're inhabiting. In Red Dead Redemption 2, every character feels so alive and involved in the world, it encourages a lot of restraint on behalf of a player who might be used to nonchalantly mowing down crowds of people on a whim in Grand Theft Auto. It's kind of like how in Japan, it's considered very rude to make any kind of extra noise when you're on a train, and you'll feel guilty if you're that guy. Like, come on man, what are you doing? The criticism comes in Red Dead's own unique way of punishing the player by making them feel like an asshole. But if every life in Red Dead Redemption 2 is supposed to have weight to it, why are they throwing enemies at you left and right at times? It has good, subtle critiques of violence, even if Rockstar themselves don't realize it. It's not a perfect critique, but there's a lot to look at in Red Dead Redemption 2 if you want to peek into the direction that some potential future critiques will come from. It's in really making you feel uncomfortable, a natural deterrent. The closer we get to representing violence realistically, the more hesitant we will be as players to be violent. I think we as humans are naturally averse to hurting other people, so there's some really interesting potential in games so realistic it legitimately feels terrible to hurt anyone. And of course, there are also the games that will take advantage of that to its fullest and create some truly disturbing yet impeccable works of art. But it also relies on the developer to give meaning to each deliberate action inputted by the player. Critique is important. Just because someone critiques, criticizes, or otherwise points out something they dislike in a video game, that doesn't mean they dislike the game or dislike gaming itself. In order for us to accept video games as an art form akin to film and music, we need to understand that people like me or people on Kotaku or wherever are going to critique video games like their film or music. It's not because we hate games, it's actually the complete and total opposite. We love video games so much, we see them as something more than they might actually be in reality. Whenever I see comments or videos saying that people who criticize Call of Duty or other franchises don't play games or they have an agenda against video gaming itself, it legitimately upsets me. It's incredibly frustrating to spend your entire life ravenously consuming video games and video game culture, only to be completely written off just because a headline misrepresented your opinion and people didn't actually read the article, or someone over-exaggerates something you said and that becomes a narrative used against you. Or maybe you messed up once out of 100 times, but that was the one offense people just couldn't tolerate, and now they'll hold it over you for the rest of your career. career. Me bringing up the white phosphorus situation wasn't just for me to bring my personal opinion into the conversation. It's because I'm sick of people denying legitimate critique just because the subject in question is just for fun, or even worse, just a video game. Because, and I'm gonna steal something from Sean here, are these the people taking gaming too seriously? Or are these the people taking gaming too seriously? I don't like starting drama, but when I see the endless droves of YouTubers constantly anger-mongering and making hours of content analyzing tweets that get 2 likes and opinion pieces, emphasis on opinion there, from Kotaku and IGN, I realize that these are the people getting in the way of real, thoughtful art critique. They hold our industry back from becoming what it can be by encouraging people to think with anger rather than genuine understanding and appreciation. The people who want a little more thought put into how Call of Duty presents itself? It might be futile thinking, expecting something greater from one of the biggest franchises in gaming, but forgive us for daring to believe in an industry where the best can be the most popular and the most popular can be the best, but only if we hold them to a higher standard. Thanks for watching. If you like what you just saw, consider subscribing and supporting the channel on Patreon. I'm gonna be honest, this neat little thing we have right now might end relatively soon. I just got a big boy college degree, and I'd kind of like to get a big boy job with that big boy college degree. And that job might come with a non-competitive clause that would prevent me from doing this the same way I am right now. But if I can, I'll do my best to keep doing this. I happen to enjoy this, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have any ambitions beyond this. Just keeping things real and transparent for you all, and I hope you can all respect and appreciate that. If anything happens, I'll let you all know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.